Picture a summer afternoon in 1974. You are 7 years old. You are standing at the edge of a river, somewhere in France, with your shoes already off. Nobody has checked the water quality. Nobody has installed a safety barrier along the bank. Nobody has issued a permit or consulted a liability assessment. You jump in. And here is the thing. Nobody thought anything of it. Not your parents. Not the people on the bank. Not a single adult in the entire country. Because this is what summer was. This video is about 15 things every European family did as a matter of daily life. Things so completely normal that nobody thought to question them. Things your parents did. Things your grandparents did. Things you did yourself on an ordinary Tuesday. Things that are now completely illegal. Number 15. Swimming in rivers and canals. Every summer the river was there. Not a public swimming pool with a lifeguard and lanes and a laminated list of rules on the wall. The reservoir on the edge of town that was cold and deep and slightly forbidden in the best possible way. You went in. Across Europe through the 1970s and 1980s, swimming in inland waterways was simply what summer meant. You jumped from bridges into canals. You swam in rivers your parents had swum in rivers their parents had swum in water that had been cooling European children for generations, before anyone thought to put a fence around it. Nobody issued permits. Nobody checked water quality reports. Nobody installed safety barriers along the bank. You walked to the edge of the water and you got in, and that was the entire transaction. Today, swimming is prohibited in most European reservoirs, forbidden in the majority of urban rivers, illegal in virtually every canal network across the continent. The legislation arrived quietly through the 1980s and 1990s. A safety concern here, a water quality report there, an insurance liability issue that somebody needed to resolve. By the time anyone thought to object, the river was already behind a fence, and the fence had a sign on it. And a generation of European children grew up never knowing what it felt like to simply walk to the edge of the water and jump. Number 14, keeping wild animals as pets. Somewhere in rural France, in 1968, a family had an owl, not in a cage, not in a sanctuary, but in the garden. It had been found as a fledgling, fallen from a nest, brought inside by the children, fed by hand until it was strong enough to go outside, at which point it went outside and stayed, because the garden was where the food was and where the family was. And it had apparently decided this was a reasonable arrangement. Nobody found this unusual. The neighbors did not report it. The authorities were not informed. It was simply the family with the owl in the garden, which was a perfectly normal thing to be. Across Europe through the mid-20th century, keeping a wild native animal as a domestic companion was completely legal and relatively common. Foxes, badgers, hedgehogs, owls. Animals found injured or orphaned and folded into the household as naturally as a stray cat. European wildlife protection legislation through the 1970s and 1980s progressively closed this world down. Each new directive tightening the definition of what could legally share your home. Each new regulation making the informal arrangement the family had always had with the creature in the garden a potential criminal offense. Today, keeping a wild native animal as a pet is a criminal offense across every European country. The owl would now require a license. The family would now require a permit. The garden is quieter and a great deal more legally compliant. Number 13. Children traveling alone. British Rail had a name for it. The unaccompanied minor service. You were handed to the guard at the departing station like a small piece of registered post. The guard signed something. You boarded. At the destination, whoever was collecting you was waiting on the platform and the guard handed you over, and that was that. A child had been successfully transported from one place to another without incident, and the whole system worked exactly as intended. This was not a special arrangement for exceptional circumstances. It was a standard service, widely used, advertised in timetables, completely unremarkable. Across Europe through the 1970s and 1980s, children as young as 6 or 7 traveled alone on public transport as a matter of course. You knew the route. You knew what stop to get off at. You had been shown twice and were trusted to manage the rest. And you did manage it, because you were 7 and you were perfectly capable of sitting on a train without adult supervision for an hour and a half. That trust was not naivety. It was an assumption about what a child of 7 was capable of. An assumption that has since been revised by law, by policy, and by a cultural shift in what childhood is understood to require. Today, an unaccompanied child under a certain age on public transport triggers child protection concerns in most European countries. The guard still works the train, but nobody hands him the children at the platform anymore. Number 12. Buying antibiotics without a prescription. In Spain in 1985, you could walk into any pharmacy, describe your symptoms to the pharmacist, and walk out 10 minutes later with a course of antibiotics. No doctor, no appointment, no referral letter, no 3-week wait for a slot that only opened because someone cancelled. Just a pharmacist who knew what you needed and gave it to you. Across southern Europe, particularly Spain, Greece, Italy, and Portugal, antibiotics were available over the counter well into the 1990s. The pharmacist was not dispensing medication prescribed by someone else. The pharmacist was making the clinical decision. And in many communities, the pharmacist had been making that decision for the same families for 30 years and knew rather more about their medical history than any doctor who had met them once for 7 minutes. The relationship between the European family and the local pharmacist was in many communities closer and more trusted than the relationship with the family doctor. The pharmacist knew your grandmother, knew what she responded to, knew what she definitely should not take under any circumstances. That relationship has been dismantled by pharmaceutical regulation across the entire European Union. Today, buying antibiotics without a valid prescription is illegal across every EU member state. The pharmacist is still there, still behind the counter, still knowing the family, but the decision now belongs to someone else entirely. Number 11. Burning garden waste. There is a smell that every European over 40 knows in their body before they know it in their mind. Autumn, late afternoon, the neighbor's garden on fire. A deliberate, managed, completely routine fire built from the accumulated organic debris of the growing season. Leaves, cuttings, the dry stalks of things that had finished, lit in the early afternoon and watched from a distance until it reduced itself to ash by tea time. This was domestic maintenance. The efficient disposal of garden waste was to burn it. You did not need a collection service or a composting arrangement or a journey to a recycling facility that closed at 4 on Saturdays. You built a pile and you lit a match, and by the end of the afternoon, the problem was smoke and embers and the best smell of the entire year. Air quality legislation through the 1990s and 2000s made it illegal progressively across Europe, country by country, region by region. Today, garden burning is prohibited across most of the continent under environmental protection law. The recycling centre is excellent. It has car parks and specific bins and staff who will tell you that cardboard goes on the left. It is very efficient. It serves an important purpose. It smells of nothing in particular. And it is absolutely not the same thing. Number 10. Leaving babies outside unattended. In 1997, a Danish woman left her baby in a pram outside a restaurant in New York City while she went inside to eat. She was arrested. She genuinely could not understand what she had done wrong. In Denmark, leaving a sleeping baby in a pram outside a cafe while the parents were inside was not just accepted. It was standard. It was considered better for the child. Fresh air, quiet, temperature regulation. The pram was visible through the window. The baby was asleep. Everything was fine. The American police saw it differently. Across Scandinavia and parts of Northern Europe, including Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and the Netherlands, leaving babies in prams outside shops and restaurants was completely normal practice through the 1980s and into the 1990s. The unattended pram on the Copenhagen pavement, a sleeping child inside it, parents 10 meters away behind glass where they could see the pram perfectly clearly. This was considered responsible parenting. The case went to court. The charges were eventually dropped. The Danish woman returned to Copenhagen, presumably somewhat baffled by the whole experience. But in most European countries today, the same scene would produce a call to child protection services before the parents had finished their first course. The pram is still on the pavement in Copenhagen. The rest of Europe has moved on. Number 9. Hitchhiking. A French university student traveled from Paris to Barcelona in 1978 without spending a single franc on transport. She stood at the edges of roads with her thumb out, and people stopped, and she got in, and eventually she arrived. The whole journey took 2 days. She slept one night in a stranger's car because the stranger was going further than she expected, and it seemed simpler than getting out. This was not considered reckless. Her parents knew she was doing it. Her friends had all done it. Hitchhiking in Europe was not an American import or a counterculture statement. It was a deeply embedded, practical arrangement. Students used it. Workers in rural areas used it where buses did not reach. Families sent older children on it to visit relatives. The driver who stopped knew something about the person getting into the car. Specifically, the person getting into the car was someone who needed to get somewhere and could not or chose not to pay for the journey. In a European social world built on assumptions of shared community responsibility that was often sufficient, the decline of hitchhiking came not from a single law, but from a gradual accumulation of fear, true crime, media coverage of incidents, a cultural shift in how strangers were understood that happened slowly enough that nobody quite noticed it happening until it was complete. Today, hitchhiking is illegal on motorways across most of Europe and socially discouraged almost everywhere else. The road is still there, people still need to get places, but the thumb stays in the pocket. Number 8. Rolling mercury in science class. At some point in a European science classroom in the 1970s, a teacher opened a jar and poured a small amount of something onto the bench in front of you. Silver, dense, moving in a way that nothing else moved, pooling and separating and rejoining itself with a logic that seemed to belong to a different category of matter entirely. You were invited to touch it. You pushed it with a finger. You tried to pick it up, and it escaped between your fingers and fell and pulled again. And you chased it across the bench with the specific delight of someone who has encountered something that refuses to be managed. The teacher watched. The other children leaned in. Nobody told you to stop. The substance was mercury, one of the most toxic materials a human being can be exposed to, now classified as a global environmental pollutant, subject to an international treaty signed by over 150 countries. Its use in everyday products is banned across the European Union. The scientist who first synthesized a compound of it in useful form received a Nobel Prize in 1925. The Nobel Committee had not yet understood what they were celebrating. Neither had you, but the mercury felt extraordinary between your fingers, and that part at least was completely true. Today, the mercury thermometer has been banned across the European Union. Mercury in schools is not a teaching aid. It is a hazardous material requiring specialist disposal. The children who rolled it across that bench in 1974 are in their 60s now, still alive, still remembering the weight of it. Number 7. The afternoon rest. At midday in Spain, everything stopped, by a rhythm so deeply embedded in daily life that it had become indistinguishable from the structure of time itself. Shops closed, schools dismissed. The street went quiet in a way that streets in Northern Europe simply did not go quiet. The shutters came down. You went home. You ate with the family. The afternoon was arranged around the rest that followed. And then in the late afternoon, the world started again. The shutters came up. The street filled, and the evening belonged to the people who had rested well enough to enjoy it properly. The siesta was not laziness. It was a structure of daily life, built on a completely different understanding of how human beings function and what a day is for. Several European countries had working time regulations that protected or mandated some version of this pause. It was not merely custom. In some places, it was law. Global commerce and European Union economic integration dismantled it progressively through the 1990s and 2000s. The shop that stayed open through lunch took business from the shop that closed. The economics made the rest period increasingly impossible to defend in regulatory terms. The regulations have been repealed. The custom has faded in most cities. What remains in some towns and regions is a ghost of what it was. A daily pause that organized European time for centuries, gone in roughly one generation, while the countries that never had it continue to eat lunch at their desks and considered this perfectly normal. Number 6, giving children alcohol. Every Sunday in France, there was wine. The bottle went around the table. The adults poured, and then your father, without pausing the conversation, picked up your glass, added a small amount of wine, filled the rest with water, placed it back in front of you, and continued talking. Nobody at that table registered this as an event. Your parents did not exchange a meaningful look. Your grandparents did not raise an eyebrow. You had a glass that was mostly water with a faint pink tint. This was simply how Sunday lunch worked. This was standard across France, Italy, Spain, and parts of Germany across multiple generations. Not the occasional indulgence of a permissive parent, but the unremarkable routine of any Sunday table. The logic was entirely coherent within the world that produced it. Wine was not an adult substance to be kept from children. It was part of the table, and the table was where the family sat. France did not set a legal drinking age of 18 until 2009. Before that, the question of the Sunday glass had existed largely outside any enforceable legal framework for centuries. Today, serving alcohol to anyone under 16 is prohibited across most of Europe. The wine still goes around the Sunday table, but the child's glass is filled with something else now, and the table is slightly different for it, though nobody can quite say exactly how. Number 5. Sending children to sanatoriums. In the early 1960s, a French doctor looked at a child, noted a mild respiratory weakness, and made a recommendation. The mountains, a residential facility in the Alps, where the air was clean and the routine was structured, and the children followed a program of fresh air and regulated meals and supervised exercise designed to address, in the doctor's professional assessment, exactly what was wrong. The parents agreed because the doctor had said so, and because this was what was done. The child was 8 years old. They were gone for 6 weeks. Across Europe, particularly in France, Germany, Switzerland, and Scandinavia, the practice of sending children to residential sanatoriums for minor ailments was standard medical practice through the mid-20th century. Not for serious illness, but for conditions that today would be managed with a prescription and a follow-up appointment. Slight underweight, general weakness, mild respiratory conditions, low stamina. The prescribed treatment was separation from the family, for weeks or months at a time, in a facility in the mountains, or by the sea where the therapeutic environment was the treatment. The parents were told this was the best thing for the child. Most of them believed it, because the doctor had said so, and the doctor knew. Today, the institutional separation of a child from their family for a minor health condition would constitute a child protection violation in every European country. The sanatoriums are mostly hotels now. The mountain air is still clean, and the children who spent their winters there are in their 70s, still remembering the specific smell of the canteen and the quality of the silence at night in a dormitory full of children who were also not quite sure why they were there. Number 4. Hitting children in school. There was something on the teacher's desk. You knew what it was. Everyone in the classroom knew what it was. The teacher did not need to use it every day. They simply needed to have it visible. Its presence was sufficient. It communicated everything that needed to be communicated without a word being said. In Scotland, it was called the tawse, a leather strap that delivered its message across the palm of the hand. In England, it was the cane. In mainland Europe, the ruler across the knuckles or the open hand across the face were common enough that they required no equipment beyond what a teacher already carried. Corporal punishment was legal in schools across virtually every European country within living memory. Sweden banned it first, in 1979. The ban made headlines across the continent. One correspondent recalled reading reactions in European newspapers that said the Swedes had gone mad. Britain banned caning in state schools in 1987. In private schools, it remained legal until 1997, the year Princess Diana died, the year the Kyoto Protocol was signed. Not a century ago. Not a generation removed from living memory. 1997. France banned it in 1991, Germany in 1983. The dates spread across the continent across 2 decades like a slow recognition of something that had always been true. The classroom with the cane on the desk is the childhood of people in their 40s and 50s watching this right now. Not history, memory. Number 3. Women needing permission. In France, in 1964, a married woman could not open a bank account without her husband's written permission. She could not apply for a passport. She could not start a business. She could not sign a contract, take a salaried job, or travel internationally without a document bearing his signature. This was not a social convention that progressive households quietly worked around. It was the law. The Napoleonic Code, last meaningfully revised in 1804, had established the legal incapacity of married women, and France had largely maintained that framework through 2 world wars, through the liberation, through the establishment of the Fifth Republic, through the early years of the space age. In Germany, a married woman could not take employment without her husband's written consent until 1977. In Spain, a married woman could not own property, travel abroad, or sign any legal document independently until 1975, the year Franco died, the year ABBA won Eurovision with Waterloo, that year. The gap between how much was expected of European women, how completely the daily running of households and families and communities depended on them, and how little the law believed they were capable of deciding for themselves is one of the most extraordinary contradictions in modern European history. And it ended not in the Middle Ages, but in the lifetimes of the mothers of people watching this video. Number 2. DDT in the family garden. On a Saturday afternoon somewhere in the Netherlands in 1962, a man sprayed his garden. A white powder dispersed from a canister in long, sweeping arcs across the lawn, the flower beds, the vegetable patch, the area under the fruit trees where the children played most. The children were inside until the spraying was done. Then they were back outside, playing in a garden that had just been treated with DDT, a pesticide celebrated since the 1940s as one of the most significant advances in pest control in human history. Its inventor received a Nobel Prize in 1948. Governments used it. Hospitals used it. Families bought it in the garden center and used it on Saturdays. Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, published in 1962, began the slow process of revealing what DDT actually did to birds, to the food chain, to the bodies of the children playing in the treated garden. The science accumulated through the 1960s. The bans came through the 1970s. Agricultural use was phased out first. Domestic use persisted in some countries longer than most people knew. Today, DDT is classified as a persistent organic pollutant. Its production and use is banned under an international treaty. The man who sprayed his garden on that Saturday was not malicious. He was protecting his vegetables with the best product available in a world that had not yet understood what the best product available was doing to everything around it. The garden is still there. The children who played in it are grandparents now. Number 1. A world before personal injury lawyers. In a garden in England in 1969, a child fell off a wall. The wall belonged to the neighbor. The child broke their arm. Their parents took them to hospital. The arm was set. The child came home with a plaster cast and a story to tell at school. A few days later, the neighbor knocked on the door to ask how the child was doing. The parents said fine, getting on very well. Thank you for asking. And that was the end of it. No solicitor's letter, no insurance claim, no liability assessment determining whether the wall had been maintained to a sufficient standard or whether adequate warning had been provided about the climbability of the wall or whether the neighbor could have reasonably foreseen that a child might climb it and fall. An accident happened, a child was hurt, the arm healed, 2 neighbors had a brief conversation at a front door. Life continued. That is not how it works now. Across Europe, personal injury law, public liability legislation, and the culture of legal redress for accidents have transformed the relationship between neighbors, between strangers, between individuals, and the spaces they share. The neighbor who once knocked on the door now calls their insurer before calling anyone else. Not because they are less caring, because the legal landscape they inhabit is completely different from the one their parents inhabited. This is the entry that requires no date, no specific country, no legislation to name, because you already know exactly what changed, and when and what was lost in the change. The wall is still there, children still fall off things, but the conversation that follows has become something that requires professional help to navigate, and the world in which a broken arm could be settled with a knock on the door and a sincere inquiry about how the child was getting on is gone now, without anyone deciding to end it. It simply became something else. Your turn now. Which of these 15 things did your family do? Which one hit you hardest today?